Hello. Now, if you were listening to yesterday's episode of Newscast, you will have heard a little bit of our interview with the 4 British families who are suing the tech giant TikTok. We've had a message from Bev, our newscaster, thank you for getting in touch, who says, I'm struggling to find the extended interview that we referenced on the show yesterday. That full interview should now be in the Newscast feed for you as a separate episode. So that should be there if you want to listen to it in full. The parents were incredibly dignified and the conversation was very moving. So I do recommend that if you have time, go look for that episode. But today we will also be rounding up today's news in this episode of Sunday's Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
And it's bye-bye Health Minister Andrew Gwynne.
See you later.
Not hello.
Exactly.
But goodbye.
Oh, I see what you did now.
Yes, that's right. Because if you put something in a public WhatsApp group, it's going to end up in the Mail on Sunday. Can I just be the person who says how it works, the news cycle?
Yes, sometimes people even put things in WhatsApp groups in order that they end up in the public domain. But Henry, if people have not heard this story, bring us up to date on what happened and the poor man's embarrassment.
Yeah, it's beyond embarrassment. I mean, it's the end of his career, not just as a government minister, but for now, and I would hazard a guess forever as a Labour MP rather than an independent MP. This is a WhatsApp group that Andrew Gwynne, who's a Labour MP in the North West, been an MP for 14 years or so, had with what it sounds like is a sort of series of local colleagues, so local party members, local politicians of sorts as well, where they weren't very nice about some of their constituents. There's one local pensioner who's been complaining about her bins, where Andrew Gwynne suggests he'd like her to die. I mean, it is clearly a quip, but a quip that is beyond tasteless. And what has clearly happened is that Mail on Sunday presented that message and a string of other very grim messages to the Labour Party for comment yesterday. And rather than hang around and wait for the inevitable, Keir Starmer and his team decided to ditch him before the story had even been published.
So the statement from Number 10 said that they wouldn't hesitate to take action against any minister who fails to meet standards required of them. I suppose the interesting thing about this is not just the importance of this to people in that constituency, the importance of it, people work in the health department, their ministers now out, there'll be, some disruption as they get someone else in. But also for the government, it's the third minister to lose their job in 3 months.
Louise Haigh, Tulip Sadiq, and now Andrew Gwynne. To lose one minister is unfortunate. To lose 3 is careless.
Well, is it careless or is it a sign of something more than that, Henry? What do you think?
What's weird about it is that, each of the 3, you don't have a story like you had when, Boris Johnson, for example, went through a string of ministerial departures in one go, and it was clear that, they couldn't, that his government was falling apart, or, Theresa May losing a lot of ministers in one go, and it was clear that the Conservative Party had unbridgeable divides over Brexit. These are all discrete cases in some way, but what each of them does also in their own way is harm the image of the Labour Party, which certainly no one holds more strongly than the Labour Party itself, that they are the virtuous party when it comes to personal conduct compared to their rivals. Because each of the 3 in a different way has had to resign or be sacked because of something to do with their personal conduct. And for a Mr. Rules Prime Minister who's already taken a bit of a battering on that front himself, that is not ideal.
Actually, you could say there's a theme of it's hard to govern. A lot of what's happened to Labour has proven how difficult it is to govern the UK, because even on arrival, they got their news cycle dominated by the cold winter fuel payments.
And then Sue Gray.
And the power struggle in Number 10, which we thought had been something that was the other parties had. Then we had 3 months to the budget. Laura and I always disagree over whether that was too long or long enough. And so could we say that Labour has learned, it'll be historic, we'll say, remember how the Labour government of 2024 learnt how hard it was to govern.
I think that's right. And something else that Henry said, that they see themselves as sort of having a bit of a virtuous reputation. I think there is something maybe wider worth observing about this, is for 2 years, Mr. Rules, as you said, he was sometimes known, Keir Starmer made hay every single day of every single week at the standards of behaviour being shoddy, embarrassing, shameful under Boris Johnson's government, and indeed as the Conservatives extended on through Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. That's a case that it's much harder for them to make now. That kind of halo doesn't look as shiny, if indeed it was ever very golden. We should just bring you also what Andrew Gwynne himself has said, because he hasn't given an interview anywhere to defend himself. Andrew Gwynne said he's sorry for the offence caused. His comments were badly misjudged. He said he understood the Prime Minister and Labour's decision. He was very sad to have been suspended, but I will support them in any way that I can.
And for newscasters who like to know how the Sunday journalism system works, we rang him, or we texted him this morning. We wanted an interview with him. I'm sure you did the same. So we have tried to reach Mr. Gwynne. And we can say, can't we, Henry, that this sort of behaviour by backbench MPs who are in opposition is very different from frontbench ministers who are in a position of ministerial power whilst in government?
Probably, although I think if this had come out, if Andrew Gwynne were a backbench Labour MP in opposition or in government, I think he probably would have been suspended from the Labour Party all the same. I mean, I think even if people have a high tolerance for kind of private chat with mates, which is what this appears to be, it's at the really extreme end of that.
But you have to wonder also for Andrew Gwynne, who was the person who, if something he thought he was in a conversation with mates, actually, who was he trusting that ended up passing that information to the Mail?
Well, and one thing that's quite interesting on that is the Mail on Sunday says that at least one other Labour MP is in this group. Now, they have clearly taken, with knowledge that we don't have, a decision editorially not to name that MP. But I think a lot of people will be curious who that MP is, why they haven't been named. Did they send messages to this group, or was it just a WhatsApp group that they had on, the annual mute where you look at the notifications once a year, or whatever it may be? But that is quite an interesting and arguably sort of journalistically tantalising detail in that story.
And what might be in the Mail tomorrow?
Yes, and
about that, or any of the other papers.
And I think, Henry, a moment ago when we began the newscast, you are our chief political correspondent. I think you said it now looks like he could even lose his seat.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. No, I was just saying that he's been suspended as a member of the Labour Party, and my hunch would be he never gets the whip back.
Right.
I don't think that. I don't know. I mean, it's possible he'd look at 4 and a bit years as an independent MP ahead of him and decide to resign his seat. I don't know about that. I also wouldn't be surprised if the Parliamentary Standards Committee ends up getting a complaint made to them. They'd then investigate him. There's a world in which they suspend him as an MP for long enough that you end up with a recall petition, and then that could potentially lead to a by-election. We're talking way down the track there. I actually don't think the Labour Party would like a by-election in his seat.
I'm sure that they wouldn't like a by-election. I don't think the Labour Party would like any by-elections at the moment if you look at where they're at in the polls. One of the people that he is allegedly being rude about was one of the MPs who neighbours him, who happens to be the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner. And by coincidence, we were speaking to her yesterday. We did our interview about an hour before the news about Andrew Gwynne broke.
Right.
So we weren't able to ask her about her view of that. What we did ask her about, among lots of other things, was her decision this week, which was controversial, probably whatever she had decided to do. But the decision that she took to take down Grenfell Tower, the place which she described as a sacred place.
I knew when I took on this role that this was something that was going to be really difficult, but a really important piece of work that had to be done. And therefore, making the decision was something that I spoke to the Grenfell community, including bereaved and survivors. There isn't a consensus. I don't think you ever will find that. It's devastating what happened. But what I want to try and do is work with the Grenfell community, the bereaved survivors, to make sure that we do justice to the fact that there is a sacred place. People lost their lives there, and make sure that there is a lasting memorial on that site.
Because I would divide this into style and substance. On the substance, I've heard it said that it's deteriorating the building. So that a government would have to take a decision on whether to rebuild or restore a burnt building, which is at the same time sacred to so many families. So we know there's an argument to be had about that, and a government can take a decision and be criticised about it. But there's another part of the story as well, which is style, because the Deputy Prime Minister has also come under scrutiny, not just for the decision she took, but the way in which she dealt with people who are grieving.
One of the people who was in attendance said to us that she ruined relationships between the survivors and the governments in half an hour. The whole thing was a car crash. So, of course, we asked her whether or not she felt that she had behaved badly in any way, and was it really the case that she had been aggressive in that meeting?
Well, I certainly don't feel like I was aggressive, and if anyone felt that way, then I would be sincerely upset about that. I think what I tried to do is take a really difficult meeting and explain to people and make sure that those that were bereaved had that information and the survivors had that information before the decision was made public.
I think what this all shows is how difficult the response to Grenfell remains for government ministers of now a second political party 8 years on. And the reason for that is because it's such a staining national tragedy, and no one disagrees on that. And it's the question of, I mean, this isn't even really the ongoing questions of why it happened and who should be culpable, if anyone, and so on, which, you know, questions which are still rolling even as the inquiry is concluded now. This is just the question of how to not just deal with the building, really. It's the broader question, right, of how to talk to the survivors and the loved ones of those who died. And I know it's something I remember from talking to ministers in the previous government that they, took extremely seriously, but always found very difficult because, you know, these are people who are deeply traumatized. And, I'm sure Angela Rayner is right when she says she'd be sincerely very upset that people feel that way, because, you know, no government minister would go into a meeting like that trying to annoy people who have gone through that.
I think it's been tricky even from day one. I remember when Theresa May went to Grenfell but didn't initially go, and then Jeremy Corbyn went. I mean, it's always presented a hugely difficult set of challenges for politicians, trying to show empathy but also trying to make decisions, and not least actually sort out the whole bigger mess that the fire revealed, which was that thousands of people were living in buildings with dangerous and unsafe cladding, which still hasn't been resolved all the years later.
You've read my mind, because I went to one. There was another fire, and it was in East London, and I went to meet the residents there, and I spoke to someone who filmed their life and death exit. The emergency exit was blocked. The scaffolding was in flames as they were trying to get out. But there are thousands of families in the UK who are still concerned they're living in unsafe buildings. Mm-hmm. So actually, in talking about Grenfell and what's happened, we should also shine a spotlight as journalists on what is happening. And that includes people who are trying to get restitution off landlords above certain height. It includes families who are concerned about the safety of buildings right now. And I've spoken to someone just 3 months ago, and they say we in the media are quick to forget them. And I remember saying to myself, I'm going to speak to them every month. And I now realise I have not spoken to them for a month, and I've made this pledge to myself. So all this talk, we're casting doubt on what everyone's role is, but we can say that journalists need to talk more about the state of high-rise buildings now.
And the whole issue of housing has political prominence now in a way that probably it had been forgotten about more generally for too long. This government's made a big promise that it's going to build 1.5 million homes by the end of this parliament. The reality for Angela Rayner is that since Labour's been in office, which is 7 months now, the trend is actually down. This is what she said.
I knew it was going to be really difficult. We could see the trend, what was happening. And when I became Secretary of State, I think within the first month, I was asked, do you want to review what you said in your manifesto around the 1.5 million homes? And we
considered ditching your target as soon as you got in?
Well, people had said, Angela, this target, when we got into government and we saw the trend was going backwards. So not only was you having to reverse the trend, but then push ahead. So we felt that it made it even more challenging, but I wasn't going to give up on the target.
It's really undoubtedly a huge priority for this government, and they've announced all sorts of things. But one of the points we discussed with her is that also the government's announced some things that I think it's a bit of a theme with the Labour government, actually, that are a bit of a contradiction. So they want to get rid of lots of planning rules. They want to make it easier for people to buy houses, but they've put up national insurance payments that builders are going to have to pay. They've increased the regulation in some areas for more landlords. They've hiked stamp duty. So it's one of these areas where there's a bit of incoherence, I think it is fair to say, in terms of the policy that they're trying to do. And here's another point raised by one of our listeners who brilliantly is talking about Angela, but she's called Angie. Angie says, Angela did not mention infrastructure to support new homes being built. It doesn't happen anywhere. Schools, GPs, transport must be built before the homes, as it just creates further problems for those buying new homes and current residents. It's an interesting point.
And she's very fairly said, I don't think any party has ever done this, and money given to local councils is redirected to other projects. There has been a problem of undersupply of housing for many, many years. We haven't built the homes. Any government hasn't built the homes they promised for years. And if you look around the country, all the younger listeners would laugh if you say how easy is it to find your own flat to pay a rent that doesn't eat up all your salary or all your weekly income. It's Labour's right to make housing a big issue they talk about, because all of our families, it's what we talk about. So it's the policy pickle they now find themselves in. Some of it is not of their making. And now they've got their hands on the levers. It seems to me, as someone who's interested in doorsteppable issues, the further we go forward, month to month to month to month, the more it is on them. But at the moment, they can usefully look in the rearview mirror. But Henry and Laura, well, you know more about this than me. It soon becomes who's at the wheel, not what's in the rearview mirror.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Henry, can you scan forward? When do you think that Labour will feel unable, or that it's not credible, to point to what they would say is the mess that they took over when they got into power?
On housing, I think they'll still be able to do that for many years. This is
Forever.
a crisis. But, well, yeah, but not quite, because they have set that target, as discussed. They have put planning and infrastructure, including housing, at the very heart of their economic agenda. They say that is the way they're going to grow the economy, is by finally building things in this country. And so if that doesn't start to happen within 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, there's two things. One is that people will be able to say, well, that's not happening. You don't look on course, for example, for your 1.5 million homes target. But the other thing is, by their own arguments, if things aren't being built fairly quickly, growth isn't going to happen. And if growth doesn't happen, the Labour Party is not going to win the next general election. We've seen that politics is volatile. We saw that Keir Starmer won the last general election after Labour went down to their worst defeat in 80 years, 5 years before. So it's almost, the blame question almost doesn't matter. They need this to happen because they themselves have come up with the idea that if this doesn't happen, if spades don't start going in the ground all over the country, then the economy is not going to get going. And if the economy doesn't get going, then the question of blame is political blame is going to be much less important than
survival.
I spoke
survival, exactly.
On Radio 4 a few weeks ago. We had the political editor of The Sun on Sunday, and I said to her in passing, apropos of something she'd said critical of the government, I said, but what if Labour gets growth and cuts hospital waiting lists, NHS waiting lists? And to which she immediately replied, well, then they'll win the next election. So, I mean, it's really intriguing to hear that it is as simple as that. If they can get the goals they said they were going to get, the whole story will change. But we're in the middle of the churn when they haven't got it.
There's a time frame thing, and this was true particularly of Rachel Reeves's speech the other day, and it's also true of housing, which is that so much of what this government has done is medium-term stuff. It's stuff that requires grasping of complicated policy nettles now in order to see gains in maybe 4 years or 14 years or 24 years. And that is not the horizon over which our angry and polarized and beaten down electorate sees things. But conversely, people say that they want politicians who finally take long-term decisions that have been dodged by short-termist politicians in the past. It's almost a bit of a paradox. But I do think it's going to be a hard argument for the government to make, but they're going to have to try to do it for a few years, which is just wait and see. These things are coming. Just
Trust
wait.
the plan.
Trust the plan. Trust the plan. And you can see already the general election campaign of 2029 being Labour is like, we've just got going, don't ditch us now. You know, things are just starting to get better. Don't undo all your hard work, Britain. What also, though, is always part of the politics, as well as all the difficult, genuinely difficult policy stuff that this government's trying to do, is, of course, how they all get on with each other. Because this is not me being flippant, but it does matter. We all know it in ourselves. It matters if you get on with your family. It matters if you get on with your work colleagues. This stuff matters. And we were joined last week by the authors of a new political book called Get In, which charts Keir Starmer's rise to power. Newscasters who've been paying attention might see that one of the headlines out of it was that Angela Rayner had been a little bit rude about her boss, Keir Starmer, accusing him of not being up to much. So did she really say that Keir Starmer couldn't run a bath?
Well, I'm not, there's a lot of things that were said in that book that I don't recognise, to be honest.
So
and
did you not say that?
And it's tittle tattle, so I don't recognise what was said in that book.
But that's not tittle tattle. That's what the woman who's now the Deputy Prime Minister is reported to have said about the now Prime Minister.
Sure, and there was lots of other things that people have said about me or anyone else, and no, I don't recognise ever saying that to anybody. But we all have frustrations when we're at work sometimes.
And then what about what she said or didn't say about Prince Andrew? Did you refer to a member of the royal family as something I'm not sure we're allowed to say on a Sunday morning, but in case we can bleep it out, did you suggest...
Again, I'm not making any comments about what said or not said.
Did you deny that you called a member of the royal family a nonce?
Said in a book. I'm not making any comment on what somebody suggests was said in a book, or actually the private conversations that I did have during the passage of the bill, which did get passed, and I did pass the bill, and I wholeheartedly supported the government at the time in passing the line of succession bill through Parliament.
You, this morning, had an interesting conversation on Broadcasting House about something we've been talking a lot about, is how on earth journalists and the rest of us as citizens and human beings should decide when to pay attention and take Donald Trump seriously and when to think, oh, that's him deliberately trying to put a cat among the pigeons. And you talked about that this morning with two very important people.
Yes. We had Andrew Neil and Christiane Amanpour addressing the question of how to triage Trump. Some of what he says is designed to provoke, is designed to own the news cycle. So what role journalists in filtering it, when even supporters here in the UK who like Donald Trump would also want to hear us discuss housing in the United Kingdom, the trajectory of the new Labour government, our relations with the European Union, the possible outcome at the Munich Security Conference.
And what was their conclusion then? Was there a joint conclusion from the journalistic titans of Christiane Amanpour of CNN and Andrew Neil of all over the Times these days? I was trying to remember.
To say of all over the place.
I was going to say formerly of this parish. I would never say that Andrew's all over the place.
Anyway.
If I don't take my life in my hands.
Yes, actually, this will really chime with newscasters, actually. It boils down to fact-checking and being really confident about the facts. And here's a little of what they both told us.
Look, the concept by Bannon and others is, quote unquote, to flood the zone. And it is designed to keep everybody off balance, potentially as a cover for doing other things. So the amount of directives, executive orders, claims have been deliberately, overwhelming in order to potentially keep people off guard.
And Andrew Neil argued that while some of what the president says is outlandish, politicians could use his unusual thinking to find practical solutions to problems in Gaza.
When he says things like what his plan for Gaza, which he reports he approaches like an real estate developer, that obviously isn't going to happen. But it raises the point which the media is useless at as well, is it what is to be done with Gaza? Who has got a solution to Gaza? It has to be rebuilt. Can that be done with 2 million Palestinians still there? Who's going to provide the money to rebuild it? What happens if and when it is rebuilt? Is it simply going to be handed back to Hamas? There's no joy in that. What is the role of the Sunni Gulf states in doing all this? Although he may have painted a rather ridiculous image of the Riviera of the Middle East, he has raised an important issue that it is not enough for Keir Starmer and David Lammy simply to mouth platitudes about a two-state solution in the Middle East, which is not going to happen in the foreseeable future.
It was really interesting to hear this morning. We spoke to President Herzog, the president of Israel, and we asked him about President Trump's plan. And he's somebody who, as a politician, as an Israeli politician, used to back a two-state solution. Maybe hard to imagine now after everything that's happened in the last few years. His answer to our question is that now Israel's policy to accept this Trump plan where Gaza would be handed to America?
Yeah.
To paraphrase him, he essentially said we need new ideas. We can't go back to a situation there where even if there's a ceasefire, at some point it tips back into violence. You go round and round and round, and there needs to be new ideas if there is to be some kind of permanent peace. Where some, even in the UK, people in diplomatic circles believe that Trump may bring positives is by provoking people into new thinking for very, very old problems.
And Henry, we'll give the final word to you. This is an intriguing triangulation for Keir Starmer, who will meet President Trump soon, because this role between the US and the EU and what to say when he's standing next to Donald Trump will be genuinely fascinating for journalists and voters.
2 of the 4 mornings that I worked this week involved me waking up, discovering that Donald Trump had said something massively significant and controversial overnight, and waiting to see first thing, by which I mean, 5 in the morning, what Downing Street might do in response. And that's just week 3 of the Trump presidency. It is such a reminder, not just of the power of the US presidency in global diplomatic and economic terms, but also of Donald Trump. And I don't think it's just flooding the zone. I think it's a man who is, increasingly emerging perhaps as the consequential US president of our era. And he is reshaping the world around what he says. And, I do share the frustration of some people with the fact that we end up talking so much about American news. But this American news is so significant for all of the world and for what the world might look like at the end of Donald Trump's first year, let alone 4 years, which at this rate are going to go at a dizzying pace.
Henry, I think you've summed it up much better than I can.
And me.
No, and you, but the substance that's there sometimes is the style, and that's the conundrum. So it's a perfect place to end. I know you're going on holiday, so we wish you a lovely time, Henry.
Have a lovely
Thank you very
time.
much. I'm still doing a week of broadcasting on Breakfast 5 Live and Stay programme for those who are interested. But
everyone's interested, but we won't see you next week. So I wish you a lovely time, and do tune into Henry all week until he goes away and lies down in a darkened room, which was what we're going to do now. So thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.